The storm battered the streets of Manhattan, turning the city into a haze of flickering lights and muted colors. The rain blurred the sharp outlines of skyscrapers and spilled onto Alexander Carrington's luxury sedan as he navigated through the chaotic traffic. Alexander, a man known for his precision and efficiency as the CEO of Carrington Holdings, focused intently on the pitch he would deliver that evening in London. It was a deal that could shift the scales of global finance in his favor. Yet, fate had a different agenda. As the car stopped at a red light, Alexander's eyes drifted to the side, drawn by an unusual sight. A young woman stood at the corner, her drenched figure barely visible under the heavy downpour. She clutched a small child close to her chest, using her thin coat as a shield against the rain. The cardboard sign in her hands, scribbled with shaky letters, read, "Please help us, no food or shelter." Alexander's grip on the steering wheel tightened. Memories of his childhood surfaced, nights spent cold and hungry before his meteoric rise to wealth. He shook his head, pushing the thoughts aside. Yet, as the light turned green and his driver prepared to accelerate, Alexander spoke abruptly. "Stop the car." The driver hesitated but obeyed, pulling over to the curb. Alexander rolled down the window and motioned to the woman. She approached cautiously, her wide eyes reflecting both gratitude and fear. "Get in," Alexander said, his voice firm yet gentle. The woman hesitated, her gaze darting to her child. After a moment's pause, she nodded and climbed into the back seat. The warmth of the car enveloped her and her baby, whose fragile cries subsided as the heater worked its magic. Alexander glanced at them through the rearview mirror, noting her trembling hands and the desperation in her expression. "What's your name?" he asked. "Lila," she whispered. "And this is Ethan." Alexander nodded, offering no further questions. The car, however, did not head toward the airport as originally planned. Instead, Alexander directed his driver to his estate, a sprawling mansion tucked away in the quieter outskirts of the city. Lila's eyes widened as the car pulled up to the grand entrance, the towering gates opening to reveal manicured lawns and a house that seemed to belong in a different world. She clutched the baby tighter, her heart pounding with a mix of awe and uncertainty. "You can stay here for the night," Alexander said, handing her a silver key. "I'll be back tomorrow. There's food in the kitchen. Make yourself comfortable." Lila stared at him, her lips trembling. "Thank you. I don't know how to—" "No need for gratitude," Alexander interrupted, his tone brusque but not unkind. "Just take care of yourself and the baby." Without another word, he left, leaving Lila standing at the entrance, overwhelmed by the unexpected kindness of a stranger. Inside the mansion, Lila moved cautiously, as if any sudden motion might shatter the illusion of safety. The warmth and luxury around her felt surreal, a stark contrast to the cold streets she had known for months. She found a guest room and laid Ethan on a bed so soft it seemed otherworldly. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, her baby smiled. His tears streamed down Lila's cheeks as she whispered promises of a better future. As the night progressed, Lila explored the mansion. The kitchen, gleaming with stainless steel and stocked with fresh food, was a revelation. She prepared a simple meal, the aroma of eggs and toast filling the air. For Lila, it was not just food, it was hope. Yet, as she sat with Ethan in her arms, the weight of her circumstances bore down on her. How had she come to this point? Just a year ago, she had been an aspiring nurse, balancing her studies and a part-time job. But life, with its cruel unpredictability, had taken everything: her family, her stability, and her dreams. Now, all she had was Ethan, and Lila woke the next morning to the soft light streaming through the massive windows of the guest room. She blinked, disoriented, before the events of the previous night came rushing back. Ethan stirred beside her, his small face serene as he slept soundly in the plush bedding. For a moment, Lila allowed herself to bask in the peace that surrounded her, a peace she hadn't felt in months. Determined not to take Alexander's kindness for granted, Lila decided to make the most of her unexpected reprieve. She wandered cautiously into the expansive kitchen again, the memories of last night's simple yet heartfelt meal warming her heart. She decided to prepare breakfast, hoping it would be a small way to repay Alexander's generosity. With Ethan perched in a high chair she found in the corner, she cooked eggs, toast, and fresh fruit, marveling at the abundance around her. After eating, she explored the mansion further. Every corner revealed another marvel artwork she'd only ever seen in magazines, hallways that seemed to stretch endlessly, and a library stocked with more books than she thought possible. She entered a sitting room where the walls were adorned with photographs and accolades. Among them, a younger Alexander stared back at her from a framed portrait, his sharp features softened by the faint trace of a smile. "Since tu wene." It was the first glimpse she had of the man beyond the title of CEO. As Lila stood there, a soft knock at the door startled her. She rushed to the foyer, her heart racing. When she opened it, a woman in a pressed uniform stood holding a delivery box. "This is for Mr. Carrington," the woman said, her tone polite but curious as she glanced at Lila and the baby in her arms. Lila accepted the package, closing the door quickly. The interaction reminded her of the reality she faced. She didn't belong here, and Alexander's kindness could not erase her struggles. But the thought of returning to the streets filled her with dread. She resolved to spend the day reflecting on her next steps. Sitting by the large window in the library, she wrote in a journal she found on one of the shelves. She began to list her dreams, things she had buried beneath layers of despair. Returning to nursing school topped the list. She wanted Ethan to grow up proud of his mother, and for that, she needed to rebuild her life. By mid-afternoon, the quiet was broken by the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Lila's stomach twisted in anticipation as Alexander stepped into the mansion. His presence filled the space instantly, his tailored suit and confident demeanor, a stark contrast to her simple clothes and bare feet. "How was the night?" he asked, his tone neutral, but his eyes scanning her and Ethan with an intensity she couldn't decipher. "It was," Lila hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "It was more than I could have hoped for. Thank you again, Mr. Carrington." "Alexander," he corrected, his expression softening. "I told you, there's no need to thank me." Lila nodded, but she couldn't shake the weight of gratitude that pressed on her chest. Before she could say more, Ethan let out a cheerful babble, reaching toward Alexander. A faint smile flickered across Alexander's face as he stepped closer, hesitating for a moment before extending his hand. Ethan grabbed his finger and giggled, the sound filling the room with a warmth that caught both Alexander and Lila by surprise. Alexander looked at Lila. "I have to ask, what's your plan now?" The question lingered heavily in the air. Lila swallowed hard, her mind racing. She didn't want to seem presumptuous or ungrateful, but the truth was, she didn't have a plan. She began, faltering. "I want to find work, rebuild what I lost. But it's hard, I have no one to help with Ethan, and..." Alexander raised a hand to stop her. "You don't need to explain," he said. "I know it's not easy." The silence that followed was almost comforting, as though Alexander understood more than he let on. Then, in a move that surprised even him, he made a decision. "You can stay here," he said, "until you're back on your feet." Lila stared at him, disbelief etched on her face. I couldn't impose?" "It's not an imposition," Alexander interrupted firmly. "Consider it a chance to start fresh, for you and Ethan." Tears welled in Lila's eyes, but she blinked them away, nodding silently. She wanted to argue, to insist she didn't deserve this, but the sheer relief of knowing she and Ethan would be safe was too overwhelming. Over the next few days, the mansion began to change. Lila's presence, and especially Ethan's laughter, brought a vitality that had long been missing. The staff, initially reserved, warmed up to her quickly. Even Alexander, who spent most of his time immersed in work, found himself lingering in the evenings to share quiet moments with Lila and Ethan. One evening, as Lila prepared dinner, Alexander entered the kitchen, uncharacteristically casual in his demeanor. He leaned against the counter, watching her. "You're different," he said suddenly. Lila paused, turning to him. "Different how?" "You've been through so much, yet you still find ways to smile," he said, his voice quieter now. "Most people in your position would have given..." Lila looked down, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. I didn't have a choice. Giving up wasn't an option with Ethan depending on me. Alexander nodded, a flicker of admiration in his gaze. For the first time in years, he felt a connection to someone beyond the superficial. Leela wasn't just surviving, she was fighting with every ounce of strength she had. One morning, Alexander surprised Lila with an envelope. Inside was a scholarship application for a nursing program, along with a letter of recommendation he had written on her behalf. I thought you might want this, he said, at his tone casual as though it wasn't a monumental gesture. Lila stared at the papers, her hands trembling. Why would you do this for me? Alexander met her eyes, his expression earnest. Because everyone deserves a second chance. Lila's voice caught in her throat as she whispered, "Thank you." As the days turned into weeks, Lila began to see Alexander in a new light. Beneath his stern exterior was a man who cared deeply, even if he rarely showed it. And for Alexander, Lila and Ethan became a reminder of what truly mattered: human connection, resilience, and the simple joys of life. But not everyone viewed their growing bond with warmth. A distant relative of Alexander's, envious of his success and now curious about Leela's presence, began to spread rumors about her intentions. Alexander, aware of the whispers, confronted the relative in a rare display of anger. "She's not here for your approval," he said coldly. "She's here because I chose to help her." The confrontation only solidified Alexander's resolve to protect Leela and Ethan. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose beyond wealth and power. Late one evening, as Lila sat by the fire with Ethan asleep in her arms, Alexander joined her. They talked about their lives, the paths that had brought them to this moment. For Alexander, it was a revelation. He shared pieces of himself he had long buried, and in return, Lila opened up about her dreams, her fears, and her hopes for the future. As the fire crackled softly, Alexander made a quiet vow. He would do everything in his power to ensure Leela and Ethan never felt the weight of despair again. For the first time in years, he felt whole, as though helping them had also saved him in ways he hadn't expected. As the weeks turned into months, the mansion transformed into a home, its once silent halls now filled with laughter and a sense of warmth Alexander hadn't realized was missing. The changes extended beyond the house. For Alexander, life became less about chasing the next business milestone and more about the simple joys he found in Lila and Ethan's presence. One Saturday morning, Alexander suggested a rare outing. He proposed they visit the city's botanical gardens, a place he hadn't set foot in since his youth. Leela hesitated, unsure about leaving the comfort of the mansion, but Ethan's excitement swayed her. The gardens were a vibrant sea of colors, with flowers in full bloom and sunlight dappling through the canopy of trees. Ethan toddled between them, pointing at bright blossoms and laughing with delight. Alexander, uncharacteristically casual in jeans and a sweater, kept pace with him, his usually stoic expression softening with each of Ethan's giggles. Lila watched the two of them from a distance, her heart swelling with emotions she hadn't dared to feel in years. This life felt like a dream, one she feared could slip away if she let herself believe in it too fully. As they sat by a serene koi pond, Alexander surprised Lila by handing her a small box. She opened it cautiously, revealing a delicate silver necklace with a pendant shaped like a blooming rose. "It reminded me of you," Alexander said simply. "Resilient, yet beautiful." Lila's breath caught in her throat. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say you'll keep believing in yourself," he replied, "and that you'll let this remind you of how far you've come." Tears welled in her eyes as she nodded, touched by the thoughtfulness behind the gift. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel that maybe, just maybe, she deserved the happiness she was beginning to find. One evening, Alexander returned home late after an important business meeting. The house was quiet, the staff already retired for the night. He found Lila in the library, a stack of textbooks and notebooks spread out before her. She was so engrossed in her studies that she didn't notice him at first. "You're working late," he remarked, his voice breaking the silence. Lila looked up, startled but smiled. "It's harder than I remember, but I'm enjoying it." Alexander approached, noticing the determination in her expression. "You're doing this not just for yourself, but for Ethan," he said. "That takes real strength." Lila tilted her head, considering his words. "You've given me that strength," she admitted. "Without you, I wouldn't have dared to try again." Alexander sat across from her, the firelight casting a warm glow over the room. "You've always had that strength, Lila. I just reminded you it was there." For a moment, they sat in companionable silence, the crackling fire filling the space between them. Alexander realized how much her presence had changed him. He no longer saw his wealth or status as the measures of his life's success. Instead, it was the connections he was forging, real, genuine bonds that gave his life meaning. A week later, Alexander found himself speaking at a charity gala, something he had always approached with detached professionalism. This time, however, his words carried a personal weight. "Life has a way of surprising us," he told the room of gathered elites. "Sometimes the most profound changes come not from what we achieve, but from the people we meet along the way." As he spoke, his eyes found Lila and Ethan in the crowd, Lila's encouraging smile grounding him in a way he hadn't felt before. He realized then that his journey wasn't just about rebuilding their lives, it was also about rediscovering his own humanity. That night, as they returned to the mansion, Alexander felt an unspoken promise take root in his heart. He would not let fear or doubt disrupt the family they were becoming. For the first time, he wasn't just imagining a better future for them, he was committed to building it. Together, Lila stood at the window of the mansion's guest room, staring out at the sprawling garden, illuminated by the morning sun. Ethan was nestled in her arms, babbling softly, his tiny fingers tugging at her hair. Her thoughts drifted to how much had changed in such a short time. The days of hunger and desperation seemed to fade into the distance, replaced by moments of unexpected peace. But even as she felt gratitude for Alexander's kindness, uncertainty lingered. Could this fragile sense of stability truly last? The sound of a soft knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. Alexander stepped inside, his usual composed demeanor softened by a faint smile. "I thought you might want to take Ethan to the park today," he said, holding up a small kite. "I haven't flown one of these since I was a kid, but I figured it might be fun." Lila chuckled at the idea of Alexander, the commanding CEO, struggling to get a kite in the air. "That sounds wonderful," she said, her smile genuine. The park was alive with the laughter of children and the rustle of autumn leaves underfoot. Ethan squealed with delight as Alexander held him up to feel the breeze, his tiny arms reaching for the colorful kite that danced in the sky. Lila watched them, a warm glow spreading through her chest. For the first time, Ethan had a sense of normalcy. As the day stretched on, Alexander and Lila shared stories about their pasts. Lila spoke of her parents, their unwavering belief in her dreams, and the ache of losing them too soon. Alexander, in turn, revealed pieces of his childhood that few knew about. The struggles, the loneliness, and the relentless drive to prove himself. "I spent so much time building walls," Alexander admitted, his gaze fixed on the kite as it soared higher. "But meeting you and Ethan, it's made me realize that those walls kept out more than they protect." Lila placed a hand on his arm, a gesture of understanding. "Sometimes the hardest part is letting yourself feel vulnerable again," she said softly. As the weeks passed, Lila grew more comfortable in the mansion, yet she remained determined to regain her independence. Alexander, noticing her quiet resolve, offered her a position at his company. It wasn't charity, he assured her, but an acknowledgement of her potential. Lila hesitated at first, unsure if she could balance the demands of work and her studies. But Alexander's confidence in her abilities gave her the courage to try. On her first day at Carrington Holdings, Lila found herself navigating a world that was both intimidating and exhilarating. The polished offices and fast-paced energy were a far cry from the life she had known just months ago. But Lila quickly proved herself. her intelligence and work ethic earning the respect of her colleagues. In the evenings, Alexander and Lila would sit together, discussing her experiences at work. He offered guidance and encouragement, his admiration for her growth evident in every word. Their bond deepened, built on mutual respect and the shared understanding of what it meant to fight for a better life. One evening, as they prepared dinner together, a rare moment of levity broke the usual routine. Lila had flour on her hands from rolling out dough, and when Alexander teased her about her technique, she smirked and playfully smeared flour across his cheek. Alexander froze, his expression a mixture of shock and amusement. "Did you just—" he began, but Lila laughed, a sound so genuine and free that it filled the entire kitchen. For the first time in years, Alexander laughed too. A deep, unrestrained laugh that startled even him. Ethan, seated nearby, clapped his hands in delight, adding to the infectious joy of the moment. It was a small, silly incident, but it left an indelible mark. For both Alexander and Lila, it was a reminder that life could still hold moments of lightness and joy, even after the darkest times. Not all moments were without challenge, however. As Lila's presence in Alexander's life became more prominent, whispers among his business associates began to spread. Some questioned her intentions, while others speculated about their relationship. Alexander, ever the pragmatist, brushed off the rumors. But for Lila, the scrutiny was difficult to bear. One evening, after a particularly grueling day at work, Lila found herself retreating to the garden, seeking solace under the starry sky. Alexander found her there, her arms wrapped around herself as she stared at the horizon. "Rough day?" he asked, his voice gentle. Lila nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "Sometimes it feels like no matter what I do, people will always see me as less." Alexander stepped closer, his presence steadying. "You're not less," he said firmly. "You're more than most of the people who judge you. Don't let their small minds diminish your strength." His words were a balm to her wounded pride, and for the first time she allowed herself to lean on him, trusting that he wouldn't let her fall. As the year came to a close, Alexander hosted his annual holiday gala, an event that brought together the city's elite. Lila was initially hesitant to attend, worried she wouldn't fit in among the glittering crowd. But Alexander insisted, going so far as to arrange for a stunning dress that made her feel like a queen. The night of the gala, Lila stepped into the grand ballroom, her heart pounding. Heads turned as she entered, whispers rippling through the crowd. But Lila held her head high, drawing strength from Alexander's reassuring smile. Throughout the evening, Alexander introduced her to his colleagues and friends, never once faltering in his quiet but steadfast support. By the end of the night, Lila realized something profound. She belonged, not because of her circumstances, but because of who she had become. In the months that followed, Lila continued to thrive, both professionally and personally. Ethan grew into a curious, joyful child, his laughter a constant reminder of how far they had come. Alexander, once consumed by ambition, found new purpose in the connections he had built with Lila and Ethan. And one afternoon, as they walked through the garden together, Ethan ran ahead, chasing butterflies. Alexander turned to Lila, his expression uncharacteristically vulnerable. "I never thought I'd say this," he began, "but you've changed me, Lila. You and Ethan, you've given me something I didn't even know I needed." Lila looked at him, her heart full. "And you've given us a life I thought we'd never have," she said softly. In that moment, surrounded by the beauty of the garden and the sound of Ethan's laughter, they both knew they had found something rare and precious. A family, built not on blood, but on love, trust, and the shared belief that second chances were worth fighting for. As the seasons shifted and the warmth of spring enveloped the city, the mansion grew even livelier, a symbol of transformation and hope. Lila had begun to find her rhythm, balancing her job at Carrington Holdings, her nursing studies, and her role as a mother. Meanwhile, Alexander continued to wrestle with emotions he had spent years suppressing, his connection to Lila and Ethan becoming an anchor he hadn't realized he needed. One evening, Alexander found himself pacing his study. It wasn't a business matter that preoccupied him. Those problems were routine, solvable. This was something far more personal. He'd always prided himself on being decisive, yet the feelings stirring within him left him unsure of his next step. He finally made a decision. Gathering his courage, he walked to the kitchen where Lila was packing Ethan's school bag for the next day. She looked up as he entered, her smile warm but curious. "Do you have a moment?" he asked, his voice tinged with a vulnerability she rarely heard. Lila set the bag aside, wiping her hands on a towel. "Of course. Is everything all right?" Alexander hesitated, then gestured toward the back patio. "Let's talk outside." The two stepped into the garden, the evening air cool but pleasant. They walked in silence for a moment, the soft crunch of gravel underfoot the only sound. Finally, Alexander stopped near a stone bench and turned to face her. "I've been thinking," he began, his eyes searching hers. "About everything, about you, Ethan, and what you've brought into my life." Lila's brow furrowed slightly, but she said nothing, allowing him to continue. "I've spent so many years focused on building my business, on achieving goals that I thought would bring me fulfillment, and I succeeded, at least on paper, but for all the success I've had, I never realized how empty it felt until you and Ethan came into my life." Lila's lips parted slightly, surprise flickering across her face. "You've given me something I can't quantify or strategize, a sense of purpose, a sense of home," Alexander said, his voice growing steadier. "I want you to know that I see you for who you are, strong, determined, and incredibly brave. And I see Ethan too. He's brought a light to this house I didn't even know it needed." Lila's eyes shimmered, and she let out a soft laugh, more from nervousness than anything else. "Alexander, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything right now," he replied quickly. "I just wanted you to know how much you both mean to me." They stood in silence, the weight of his words settling between them. Lila finally spoke, her soft. "You've changed our lives too, Alexander, more than I can ever express. But it's not just about what you've given us. It's about how you made us feel safe." Their eyes met, and in that moment, words felt unnecessary. Alexander reached out, his hand brushing hers in a gesture of quiet reassurance. As time passed, Alexander and Lila began to spend more moments together outside the structured world of work and responsibilities. One weekend, he suggested they take Ethan to a nearby horse farm, a place he used to visit as a child. The idea delighted Ethan, who had never seen a horse up close before. The farm was nestled in the countryside, surrounded by rolling hills and endless fields of wildflowers. Ethan squealed with delight as he fed a gentle pony a handful of carrots, his laughter echoing across the open space. Alexander stood nearby, watching the scene with a rare look of contentment. "You're good with him," Lila said, coming to stand beside him. Alexander smiled faintly. "He makes it easy." Lila glanced at him, a hint of mischief in her expression. "Ever ridden a horse?" He raised an eyebrow. "Not since I was a teenager. Why?" "Because you're about to," she said with a grin, grabbing his hand and pulling him toward the stable. Minutes later, Alexander found himself atop a tall chestnut horse, his normally confident demeanor replaced with cautious uncertainty. Lila, seated comfortably on another horse, couldn't suppress her laughter. "Laugh all you want," he said, adjusting his grip on the reins. "Just remember who convinced me to do this." "Noted," she replied, her smile wide. "Now come on." The trio spent the afternoon riding through the trails, Ethan perched safely on Lila's lap as they moved at a gentle pace. The experience was both exhilarating and grounding, a reminder of life's simple pleasures. Back at the mansion, Lila found herself growing more involved in the household. She began to take on small projects, organizing the library, tending to the garden, and even helping the staff with meal planning. It was a way to contribute, to feel more connected to the place that had become her sanctuary. One evening, while sorting through a box of old photographs she'd found in a storage room, she stumbled upon an album filled with images of Alexander's younger years. There were pictures of him as a boy, his serious expression offset by the mischievous sparkle in his eyes. There were also photos of his parents, their pride in him evident. When Alexander walked in and saw the album in her lap, he froze for a moment before sitting beside her. "I didn't know you kept these," Leela said, her tone gentle. Alexander shrugged. "I don't look at them often." Leela turned a page, her fingers tracing the edges of a photograph. "They must have been proud of you." "They were," Alexander said quietly. "But they were also distant. My father believed in tough love. He thought success required sacrifice, and he didn't spare me from that." Lila looked at him, understanding dawning in her eyes. "That must have been hard." "It was guo," he admitted, "but it shaped me, for better or worse." They continued flipping through the album together, their shared silence filled with unspoken understanding. For Alexander, it was the first time he'd allowed someone to see this vulnerable side of him. As spring turned to summer, the mansion hosted a small but significant event. Alexander, in collaboration with Lila, had organized a charity fundraiser for local shelters, a cause close to both their hearts. The event was intimate, attended by friends, colleagues, and a few key figures in the community. Lila, dressed in a simple yet elegant gown, moved through the room with ease, her confidence a testament to how far she had come. Ethan, dressed in a tiny suit, charmed the guests with his infectious laughter. During the event, Alexander took to the stage to deliver a speech. He spoke not only about the importance of giving back, but also about the people who had inspired him to do so. "Sometimes the greatest changes in our lives come from the most unexpected places," he said, his eyes briefly meeting Lila's in the crowd. "It's not just about what we achieve, but about the connections we make and the lives we touch." And his words were met with applause, but for Lila, they resonated on a deeper level. She realized that Alexander wasn't just talking about charity, he was talking about them. As the night wound down, Lila stood on the balcony overlooking the garden, Ethan asleep in her arms. Alexander joined her, his presence quiet but steady. "You've done so much for us," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "You already have," Alexander replied, his gaze soft. "By reminding me of what really matters." Lila smiled, her heart full. For the first time in years, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. As the weeks passed, a new rhythm settled over the mansion, one defined by purpose and a growing sense of belonging. Lila, now deep into her nursing studies, often stayed up late at the dining table, surrounded by textbooks and notes. Alexander, ever curious, sometimes joined her, bringing a cup of tea or offering to quiz her on medical terms. One night, as she scribbled furiously in her notebook, Alexander leaned against the doorway and watched her. The determination in her expression reminded him of the ambition that had once driven him, but unlike his relentless pursuit of success, Lila's drive was rooted in something far deeper, a desire to build a life of security and hope for her son. "What's the topic tonight?" Alexander asked, stepping into the room. "Pediatric care," Lila replied without looking up, her focus unwavering. "Ah, so you're studying how to deal with Ethan's next inevitable round of scraped knees and misadventures," he teased, earning a soft laugh from her. "Pretty much," she said, finally glancing up, "though I doubt he'll stop running headfirst into trouble anytime soon." Alexander chuckled, his gaze lingering on her for a moment. "You know, Lila," he began, his tone thoughtful, "watching you work this hard, balancing everything, it's inspiring." She raised an eyebrow, her smile playful. "Coming from you, that's high praise." He shrugged, a small grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. "It's just the truth." Their shared laughter carried through the quiet house, a sound that had become increasingly familiar over the months. The turning point came on a sunny Saturday morning. Alexander suggested a trip to a nearby lake, a place he'd visited as a child but hadn't seen in years. Lila hesitated, concerned about taking a break from her studies, but Alexander was persistent. You can't pour from an empty cup, he said. You need a day to recharge. Reluctantly, she agreed, and the three of them packed a picnic and headed out. The drive was filled with Ethan's chatter and the occasional playful debate between Alexander and Lila about music or favorite childhood memories. When they arrived, the sight of the crystal-clear water surrounded by lush trees took Lila's breath away. Ethan wasted no time running toward the shore, his tiny feet kicking up sand as he giggled in delight. Alexander set up the picnic while Lila sat by the water, watching Ethan splash and play. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to fully relax. The weight of her responsibilities seemed to lift, if only for a little while. As the afternoon wore on, Alexander joined her by the water's edge. They watched Ethan together, their shoulders occasionally brushing. "Thank you for this," Lila said softly, her gaze never leaving Ethan. "I didn't realize how much I needed it." Alexander smiled, his expression warm. "Sometimes, we all need to step back and just be." The simplicity of the day left an imprint on both of them. A reminder that life's most meaningful moments often came in the quietest of ways. That evening, back at the mansion, Alexander found himself reflecting on the day. He realized that in helping Lila and Ethan rebuild their lives, he had also begun to mend parts of himself he hadn't even known were broken. He stepped into the library, a place that had once been his refuge but now felt fuller, more alive. On a whim, he reached for a leather-bound journal, something he hadn't used in years. Sitting by the fire, he began to write, not about business plans or future goals, but about the simple joys of the present. As his pen moved across the page, he wrote about Ethan's laughter, Lila's resilience, and the way they had transformed his once empty house into a home. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of clarity, a purpose beyond the corporate world. The next morning, Alexander handed Lila the journal. She looked at him, puzzled. "What's this?" she asked. "A way to remember," he said simply. "Not just for me, but for us, for Ethan. I thought it might be nice to document everything, where we've been, where we're going." Lila opened the journal, her eyes scanning the first page. Her breath hitched as she read Alexander's heartfelt words, his reflections on their journey together. She looked up at him, her eyes shining. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Thank you." Alexander nodded, his expression soft. "It's just the beginning." And with that, they continued to write their story together, one built on trust, hope, and the unwavering belief that second chances could lead to something extraordinary. Want more? Check out the video on screen for another amazing story and hit subscribe to stay updated with our newest content.